Before the first cities, the land that would one day cradle the Indus Valley Civilization existed in a state of quiet transformation. A vast landscape shaped by rivers that wandered freely across floodplains, carving new paths and abandoning old ones over centuries. And in this environment, long before the rise of cities, before architecture, before organized trade, and before the familiar rhythms of planned settlement took form, human communities began the slow and steady pattern of movement, observation, and adaptation that would eventually give rise to one of the world's earliest and most sophisticated urban civilizations. And the earliest chapters of this story unfold not in monumental ruins or written records, but in the subtle traces left behind by people who lived lightly upon the land, yet carried within their choices the seeds of future cities. And across these plains, the rivers that would later sustain Harappa, Mohenjo Daro, Dholavira, and countless other settlements flowed with immense energy, their seasonal floods laying down layers of fertile silt, creating a landscape where grasses, shrubs, and wild grains flourished. And early groups of hunter-gatherers, moving across this terrain, learned to understand its rhythms, to recognize the arrival of monsoon, to anticipate the retreat of waters, and to locate the richest patches of vegetation. And over time, this knowledge deepened, becoming a body of generational memory that guided movement and decision. And as these communities gathered plant foods, hunted game, and fished along riverbanks, they also experimented with early cultivation, gradually domesticating grasses into wheat and barley, and domesticating animals such as cattle, sheep, and goats. And these slow transformations, spread across centuries, marked the beginning of a shift from pure mobility to seasonal return, a pattern in which people began to revisit the same areas during certain times of year, building temporary dwellings, leaving behind tools and pottery fragments, and forming memories of place that would eventually strengthen into permanence. And among the earliest known settlements connected to this deep past is Mehrgarh, though not part of the Indo-Gangetic Plains proper, yet culturally linked through early networks of migration, exchange, and shared practices. And Mehrgarh's early layers reveal the developments that would later define the early Harappan world, including the domestication of wheat, barley, and cattle, the production of pottery, and the creation of ornaments made from shell, stone, and copper, showing that the foundations of craftsmanship and agricultural knowledge had already taken root well before the mature Harappan cities emerged. And as these early communities learned to manage land and resources, they began forming settlements with increasing stability, building houses with mud brick, storing surplus grain, and relying on seasonal flooding as a predictable cycle, rather than an unpredictable threat. And generation after generation, the people who lived close to these shifting rivers learned to read their patterns, adjusting their settlements to avoid the most destructive floods while benefiting from the rich soils left behind. And in this period, the seeds of what would become a highly structured and cooperative society were beginning to appear. For the management of land, crops, water, and resources required shared effort, communication, and coordination across families and groups. And as these patterns spread across the region, archaeological evidence reveals early signs of planning, even in small settlements, where houses were arranged around open courtyards. Pottery styles grew increasingly standardized, and tools were shaped with consistent methods, all of which demonstrate cultural cohesion and shared expectations stretching across wide distances. and these early societies understood the benefits of cooperation, organizing themselves in ways that suggest emerging social structures capable of managing labor, distributing resources, and maintaining settlement spaces across multiple seasons. And the rivers, always the central force of the region, continued to shape human life in profound ways, for their seasonal floods determined planting and harvest times, their shifting channels dictated where settlements could thrive, and their flow supported a diversity of plants and animals that formed the basis of both diet and economy. And in this world, the people who would one day build the great cities of the Harappan civilization learned to depend not on monumental displays of power, but on subtle mastery of the land, perfecting the quiet arts of timing, patience, cooperation, and environmental reading. And as centuries passed, the communities of the region expanded in both number and complexity, with some reaching sizes that represented true villages, linked by trade routes, shared pottery traditions, early craft specialization, and symbolic practices that suggest ritual or spiritual beliefs connected to nature, fertility, and seasonal cycles. And the archaeological record, though sparse compared to later eras, offers glimpses of this early world, revealing grinding stones, hearths, storage pits, ornaments, figurines, and tools, each piece reflecting the presence of human intention, human adaptation, and the slow accumulation of cultural identity that would eventually crystallize into a full civilization. And as the people continued to build, farm, craft, and trade, their settlements grew in stability, leading to more permanent structures, greater social coordination, and the early development of spatial organization, laying the groundwork for the extraordinary urban planning that would later define the mature Harappan world. And though these early settlers could not have foreseen the monumental achievements that would arise from their steady efforts, their daily choices, shaped by the landscape and its cycles, laid the foundation for one of the most remarkable cultural developments in human history, a civilization built not on conquest or monumental display, but on the quiet strength of cooperation, environmental understanding, and the enduring relationship between people and the rivers that sustained them. In the quiet unfolding of this narrative, there are further layers that deepen the listening experience. For every settlement, riverbank, workshop, and household carried stories shaped by patience and observation, and when we look closer, we see how generations lingered with the land, learning its language through seasons, shifts in soil, movements of animals, and the turning of winds. And these subtle exchanges between people and their environment nurtured a world where memory was not written in texts but carried in tradition, in the unspoken passing of methods, in the calm repetition of daily tasks, and in the shared understanding that stability grew from cooperation. And so with each passing century, the character of these communities deepened, shaped by the textures of clay, the rhythm of footsteps along narrow paths, the murmur of water stored in deep wells, and the gentle glow of lamps that illuminated evening gatherings. And through these details the civilization shaped itself quietly, forming the emotional and cultural foundations that would echo long after its cities softened into earth, leaving listeners with the sense that every moment, no matter how small, contributed to the enduring calm and balance that defined the spirit of this ancient world. As centuries continued their steady passage across the plains of the northwestern subcontinent, the early communities that once moved lightly with the rhythm of the seasons began to anchor themselves more firmly to the land, and this subtle transformation marked the beginning of what archaeologists call the early Harappan phase, a time shaped not by sudden innovations or monumental structures, but by countless small decisions that gradually reshaped the human presence across the region, and in sites such as Mergar, Amri, the earliest layers of Dholavira, and many smaller villages, patterns of permanence began to appear, and although these people left behind no written records, their pottery, stone tools, mud brick houses, and burial practices reveal a society becoming increasingly organized, increasingly structured, and increasingly tied to predictable agricultural cycles, and stability emerged from the cultivation of wheat and barley, from the herding of cattle, sheep, and goats, from the careful storage of surplus grains, and from pottery traditions that grew more refined with each generation, each repeating pattern, quietly suggesting that ideas and techniques were being shared across distances, and as simple trade routes began to stretch across the landscape, carrying shells from distant coasts, beads from established workshops, stones from highlands, and early copper from nearby sources, the exchange of goods encouraged the exchange of cultural practices, shaping how people built houses, made tools, and organized their communities. And houses slowly developed more consistent layouts with rectangular rooms, mud brick foundations, and open courtyards that connected private life with shared spaces. And these architectural decisions reflected evolving ideas about family structure, cooperation, and division of labor. And within this world, early craft specialists appeared, potters who shaped vessels with practiced precision, bead makers who drilled and polished stones, tool makers who chipped blades from flint, and metal workers who began heating and shaping copper. And their presence marked a shift from household production to more coordinated systems that required collaboration, resource sharing, and social understanding. And as settlements expanded, so did their ability to shape the land around them, and people dug deeper wells, built granaries for long-term storage, carved storage pits into packed earth, and constructed protective embankments to work with the seasonal rhythms of local rivers, and water guided nearly every choice. For early inhabitants learned to read the land with remarkable sensitivity, choosing sites where seasonal floods renewed the soil without threatening their homes. And this deep environmental awareness would later support the sophisticated planning of the mature Harappan cities. And across the region, scattered yet connected villages formed early networks of shared cultural identity, and even without writing, communication flowed through similar pottery designs, comparable house plans, shared burial practices, and trade routes that carried both materials and meaning across great distances. And this expanding cultural unity signaled the quiet rise of a society moving steadily toward complexity. And although the people of this era could not have known what their daily labor would lead to, their choices, from storing grain to shaping walls and organizing work, formed the foundation for one of the earliest urban civilizations in the world. And over time, seasonal camps gave way to permanent settlements centered around predictable agricultural cycles, and early towns grew into places where farmers, herders, craftsmen, and traders met and exchanged knowledge. And the rhythm of daily life began to synchronize with natural forces, the timing of floods, the shifting of soils, the movement of animals, and the changing winds that carried dust across the plains. And with each passing century, communities deepened their understanding of land and climate, adapting to challenges with patience, cooperation, and long-held memory. And courtyards became the heart of each settlement, their surfaces marked by footprints, grinding stones, drying pottery, and the soft sound of conversations that carried through warm evenings. And in workshops, tools were sharpened beneath shaded awnings, beads were polished to bright colors, and clay was shaped and fired in simple kilns. and every small detail contributed to a cultural fabric woven slowly and silently over generations. And when we look closely, deeper layers emerge. For each settlement, each riverbank, each household and workshop carried stories shaped by observation, trial, and continuity, and generations learned to read the soil by its color and texture, to locate underground water by watching plants and animals, to predict storms by sensing the movement of air. And this knowledge passed quietly from one generation to the next, not through writing but through repetition and shared experience. And memory lived in tradition, in the way tools were made, in the methods of storing grain, in the timing of planting and harvesting. And with each century the character of these communities deepened, shaped by the textures of clay drying under sunlight, by the rhythm of grinding stones on grain, by the murmur of water lifted from deep wells, and by the gentle glow of lamps during evening gatherings. And children shaped small figurines from soft clay, elders watched the horizon to interpret changes in the seasons, and families repaired walls with fresh layers of mud after each monsoon. And through these ordinary scenes the civilization formed itself patiently, creating emotional and cultural foundations that would echo long after early settlements faded back into the earth. And the choices, patience, and quiet resilience of these early communities reveal that even the smallest actions contributed to the balance and calm that defined the spirit of this ancient world. And from these early networks of settlements, connected by trade, unified by shared practices, and strengthened by familiarity with land and water, the first foundations of a great urban civilization were quietly taking shape, preparing the way for the orderly and remarkable cities that would appear in the centuries to come. As the early Harappan world continued to expand across the plains of the northwest, the settlements that once appeared as small clusters of mud brick houses began to grow in size, in structure, and in intention. And as generations passed, the people of the region developed an increasingly refined understanding of how to build, how to organize space, and how to shape their communities according to both practical needs and cultural expectation. And it is within this era that the earliest expressions of planned architecture began to appear, expressions that would eventually evolve into the defining hallmark of the Indus Valley Civilization, the grid-like order that would come to characterize cities such as Harappa and Mohenjo Daro. And although the earliest versions of this order were not as formal or monumental as the layouts seen in the great urban centers of the mature Harappan age, they nonetheless reveal a striking awareness of spatial arrangement, for houses in several settlements began to align themselves along straighter paths, and lanes began to follow consistent orientations that often reflected the direction of prevailing winds, the movement of water, and the desire to create predictable routes for daily life. And such choices were neither accidental nor merely utilitarian, but demonstrated a growing preference for shared order and cooperative planning among households. And in many pre-urban sites, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of early drainage systems, simple channels at first, yet remarkable for their intention and design, for they reveal an early awareness of hygiene, waste management, and the need for comfortable long-term habitation. And these features distinguish the ancestors of the Harappan people from many other contemporary cultures. For while others built temporary huts or simple shelters, the early communities of this region invested in permanence, durability, and continuity, creating settlements that could withstand seasons, floods, and generations of use. This growing sense of permanence is most clearly visible in the increasing reliance on mud brick, shaped into consistent sizes, dried with care, and laid in orderly courses that created strong and reliable walls, and the uniformity of these bricks, even across distant regions, hints at communication networks, shared standards, and a cultural cohesion that stretched across the land. And such cohesion, gradual yet steady, became the backbone of the civilization that was beginning to rise. For when people across great distances use the same brick proportions, similar pottery motifs, and comparable construction methods, they reveal an identity that moves beyond isolated villages and into the realm of a connected culture, one that shares not only materials, but expectations and ways of thinking. And through this shared fabric traveled knowledge, memory, and experience, forming the earliest threads of a collective identity. As settlements expanded, new structures appeared, including early platforms for gatherings, communal storage buildings designed for grain and shared resources, and designated workshop spaces where craftsmen shaped pottery, chipped stones, polished beads, or worked with early metal tools. And each of these developments signaled increasing social organization, for they required cooperation, planning, and a recognition of shared priorities. And with each generation, the act of building itself became a cultural expression, a reminder that stability and intention were central to community life. As the later centuries of the early Harappan era approached, some settlements grew large enough to require more formal planning, and these proto-urban centers marked the shift from scattered village clusters into towns that could support larger populations, more specialized occupations, and more complex systems of management and resource distribution. And although writing had not yet emerged to record their choices, the layout of these settlements spoke clearly of a society moving steadily toward the ordered sophistication that would later define the Harappan world. As architectural patterns continued to evolve, the people who shaped these landscapes refined their building methods through repeated cycles of construction, repair, and adaptation. And with each new wall or platform they carried forward the quiet lessons of the generations before them, allowing settlements to become living records of communal memory. For each wall reflected experience with floods, each platform reflected a response to winds and sun, and each courtyard represented an understanding of how families lived and interacted over time. As these patterns spread outward across valleys and plains, the shared architectural language that emerged laid the structural foundation for the remarkable order that would later define the great cities of the Indus Valley Civilization. In this quiet unfolding of built landscapes, deeper layers of meaning appear. For every settlement, every riverbank, every courtyard and workshop carried stories shaped by patience, attention, and observation. And when we look closely, we see how generations lingered with the land, learning its language through the rise and fall of seasons, through the shifting of soil after rain, through the movements of animals that marked subtle changes in climate, and through the turning of winds that signaled the arrival of new weather. And these subtle exchanges between people and their environment nurtured a world where memory was not kept in writing, but in tradition, in the repetition of tasks perfected over time, in methods taught quietly from one generation to the next, and in the shared understanding that stability came from cooperation and long practice. With each passing century, the character of these communities deepened, shaped by the textures of clay drying in sunlight, by the soft rhythm of grinding stones working through grain, by the murmur of water drawn from deep wells, and by the gentle glow of lamps that illuminated gatherings at dusk. And children shaped small figurines from clay as they watched elders repair walls or shape tools, and families gathered in courtyards during cool evenings, sharing food, stories, and experience that tied one generation to the next. And through these ordinary scenes, the civilization shaped itself slowly, forming emotional and cultural foundations that would echo far beyond their time. In these early settlements, every moment contributed to something larger, for even the smallest acts of care and cooperation created patterns that endured long after their cities softened back into the earth, leaving the sense that every footprint, every pot, every brick, and every quiet decision helped build the calm order that defined the spirit of this ancient world. And from these early networks of settlements, linked by trade, unified by shared practices, and strengthened by intimate understanding of land and water, the earliest architectural foundations of a great civilization took form, preparing the way for the astonishingly ordered and carefully planned cities that would rise in the centuries to come. As the early Harappan world matured and its settlements continued to expand across the river plains, the quiet foundations of order that had taken shape over earlier centuries began to transform into something far more deliberate. For this was the moment when the people of the region started to think not only of individual houses and footpaths, but of the larger idea of cities that required vision beyond immediate needs, cities that demanded cooperation, shared planning, and a thoughtful use of space that could support both daily life and long-term growth. And in these gradually expanding settlements, the principles that would one day define the mature Harappan civilization began to take recognizable form, for across the landscape places such as Kalibangan, Banawali, and the rising levels of Harappa revealed patterns of planning that reached far beyond anything seen in earlier generations, and these growing towns were no longer simple clusters of homes that developed without direction, but intentional settlements shaped by a quiet yet coherent understanding that alignment, symmetry, and predictable organization brought a sense of stability and balance to community life. And the earliest grid patterns that appeared in this era were the first subtle expressions of a spatial logic that would reach its most refined form in Mohenjo Daro and other great Harappan cities. And although these early grids were not perfectly uniform, they showed a clear desire for order, with homes arranged along straight streets, with lanes that met at right angles, and with carefully placed open areas that became natural gathering spaces for the people who lived there. And this planning reflected a society that had begun to see itself as interconnected, a society that understood that the well-being of each household depended on decisions made for the settlement as a whole. Evidence of increasingly sophisticated drainage systems made this shift even clearer, for channels and covered drains ran beneath houses and along streets, guiding wastewater away from living spaces, an unusual feature for ancient communities, and one that revealed not only technical skill, but a cultural value placed on cleanliness, comfort, and the careful management of shared environments. As settlements grew larger, the buildings within them also became more specialized, with granaries constructed on raised platforms to protect stored grain from moisture, with walls and passages that separated different kinds of activity, with workshops arranged away from residential areas, and with designated spaces for storage, trade, and craft production. And these decisions reveal an early form of zoning, a thoughtful approach to organizing space that allowed people to live, work, and store resources in ways that minimized conflict and maximized efficiency. The widespread use of standardized bricks across regions separated by hundreds of kilometers shows that cultural connections had become strong, for only a society with shared norms and stable communication could maintain such consistent building practices across distances. And as these proto-urban centers became increasingly complex, the need for collective labor and some form of leadership also grew, although the nature of that leadership remains unclear, for the Indus world left behind no monumental palaces, no carved images of kings, and no inscriptions that proclaimed the power of rulers, suggesting that authority may have rested with councils, skilled planners, respected elders, or groups of families rather than one central figure. And the absence of overt symbols of dominance gives these settlements a unique character among the ancient civilizations of the world. As time passed, these expanding communities formed a wide cultural zone stretching from Baluchistan to Gujarat, and from Rajasthan to Punjab, unified not through warfare but through shared practices, shared technologies, and shared expectations about how a settlement should be organized. And within this zone the quiet seeds of full urbanization took root, and it became only a matter of time before the larger cities of the mature Harappan world emerged with their remarkable clarity of design and order. The birth of urban planning marked a gentle but profound transformation of the early Harappan world, guiding it toward a civilization whose strength lay not in conquest or towering monuments, but in precision, harmony, and the disciplined management of space. As these principles continued to evolve, the people of the region improved their understanding of how settlement layout could support the rhythm of daily work, the gathering of families, and the efficient flow of water, grain, and tools. And with each building season they brought forward the lessons learned from earlier generations, allowing their towns to grow with intention rather than chance. And across these landscapes early hints of coordinated public works, civic responsibility, and community planning began to appear, preparing the cultural mindset that would guide the great Harappan cities. In this quiet unfolding of order, there are deeper layers that reveal the lived experience of these early people. For every settlement, every workshop, every riverbank held memories shaped by patience, attention, and the daily observation of the natural world. And when we look closely, we see how generations learned the land through the rise and fall of seasons, through shifting soil after rain, through the habits of animals that signaled subtle changes in climate, and through the turning of winds that announced the arrival of new weather. And these exchanges between people and their environment nurtured a world where memory did not live in writing but in practice, in the repetition of tasks performed with care, in the passing of knowledge from one generation to the next, and in the shared belief that stability grew from cooperation. With each passing century, the character of these communities deepened, shaped by the textures of clay bricks drying beneath the sun, by the quiet tapping of tools in narrow lanes, by the murmur of water lifted from deep wells, and by the warm glow of lamps that illuminated gatherings in the evening. And through these ordinary details the civilization shaped itself slowly, forming emotional and cultural foundations that would echo long after its cities softened into the earth, reminding us that every small decision, every steady improvement, and every act of shared labor contributed to the calm and enduring spirit of this ancient world. As the developing Harappan world moved steadily toward full urban expression, the people who lived across the plains and river valleys of the Northwest began shaping not only their settlements, but their cultural identity. And this identity emerged gradually through the objects they made, the materials they valued, the technologies they refined, and the aesthetic choices that silently connected distant communities into a unified civilization. And it is in this age that the crafts of the Indus Valley began to flourish with extraordinary depth. For artisans across the region produced pottery, beads, tools, ornaments, figurines, and seals with a level of skill, consistency, and refinement rarely seen in the ancient world. And the objects they left behind reveal a society that cared deeply about precision, balance, and quiet beauty. Even though it did not seek grandeur in colossal monuments or dramatic sculptures, and the pottery of this era, shaped from carefully selected clay and fired with practiced control, often adorned with simple geometric patterns or smooth burnished surfaces, speaks to artistic intention supported by technical mastery. For each vessel shows choices that reflect generations of knowledge passed through families and workshops. And beads, among the most celebrated artifacts of the Harappan tradition, were produced in remarkable quantities and astonishing variety, using carnelian, steatite, faience, shell, agate, jasper, lapis lazuli, and other treasured materials. And the making of these beads required controlled heating, precise drilling, and delicate polishing, tasks that demanded patience, specialized tools, and years of experience. And the presence of such beads in far distant regions, from Mesopotamia to Central Asia, reveals the long trade networks that connected the Harappan world to neighboring regions, networks that moved goods, ideas, and cultural meanings across immense distances. In addition to ornaments, the people of this period crafted tools from copper, stone, and bone, and these tools were not crude or improvised but standardized and designed for specific tasks, revealing a stable technological base and an advanced understanding of material properties. And among their most distinctive creations were the seals carved from steatite, featuring animals, symbols, and early inscriptions that would later form the core of the Harappan script. And these seals were not merely decorative items but functional devices used to mark goods, secure containers, identify ownership, and support systems of trade and administration, suggesting that long before the rise of monumental writing, the Harappan world had already developed organized economic systems. The motifs that appear on these seals, from the humped bull to the unicorn-like creature to the elephant, rhinoceros, tiger, and various abstract symbols, reveal a shared visual language that formed an essential part of Harappan cultural identity. And even though the meanings of these symbols remain undeciphered, they reflect a worldview rooted in ritual, memory, and a deep connection to animals and nature. And their uniformity across vast regions demonstrates the strong cultural cohesion that shaped this civilization. This cohesion extended beyond art and ornament into broader expressions of standardization, for similar weights, measures, and brick sizes appear across thousands of kilometers, showing that a single conceptual framework for building, measuring, and organizing space connected the scattered settlements of the region into a unified cultural zone. And such standardization required communication, shared understanding, and mutual trust, all of which reveal a society deeply interconnected through trade, craft specialization, and shared values. As artisans refined their skills over the centuries, their creations became essential to the economic systems that linked settlements together, forming networks that moved raw materials, finished goods, and perhaps even stories and beliefs across long distances. And these networks strengthened the bonds between communities, helping to unify the region into a cultural landscape that would soon give rise to a fully developed Harappan identity. The craftsmanship of the Indus Valley did more than shape daily life, for it supported long-distance trade, influenced social roles, and expressed cultural meaning in ways that endured long after the civilization itself had faded, leaving behind objects that offer modern researchers one of the clearest windows into this ancient world, a world that valued precision, balance, order, and subtle artistry above displays of power or monumental architecture. As artisans passed their methods across generations, their work grew into an expression of identity woven through texture, color, and form, and each bead, seal, pot, figurine, and carved fragment held layers of meaning that revealed how the people of this world understood beauty, utility, and memory. As workshops expanded within growing settlements, The rhythm of shaping clay, polishing stone, carving steatite, and firing pottery blended seamlessly into daily life, filling the air with sounds that echoed through the narrow streets and shaded courtyards. And through these shared activities, the people of the early Harappan world formed a subtle yet unmistakable cultural signature, one that continued to strengthen as the civilization approached its fully matured form. In the quiet unfolding of this narrative, there are deeper layers that enrich the listening experience. For every settlement, every riverbank, every workshop and household carried stories shaped by patience, observation, and long familiarity with the land. And when we look closer, we see how generations lingered with their environment, learning its language through the rise and fall of seasons, through the patterns of soil after rain, through the shifts in water flow, through the movements of birds and animals, and through the shifting winds that carried hints of approaching monsoon or lingering summer heat. And these subtle exchanges between people and their environment nurtured a world where memory was not preserved through writing, but through lived tradition, through the steady repetition of tasks performed with care, through lessons spoken quietly at dawn or during work, through the careful watching of skilled hands shaping raw materials into objects of purpose, and through the shared understanding that stability and harmony grew from cooperation rather than struggle. With each passing century, the character of these communities deepened, shaped by the textures of clay drying under sunlight, by the faint echo of footsteps along narrow paths, by the murmur of water stored in deep wells, by the glow of lamps that illuminated evening gatherings. And through these countless details, the civilization shaped itself quietly, forming emotional and cultural foundations that would echo long after its cities softened into earth, reminding listeners that every small act of care, every crafted object, and every moment of shared labor contributed to the enduring calm and balance that defined the spirit of this ancient world. As the Harappan world moved steadily toward its mature expression, the growing settlements across the Indus region began to weave themselves into a vast web of exchange, a network that reached far beyond the boundaries of the subcontinent. And this web, formed through countless journeys, agreements, and shared expectations, became one of the defining features of the civilization. For the people of the Indus Valley were not isolated builders of cities, but active participants in long-distance trade, moving materials, ideas, and cultural practices along routes that crossed plains, deserts, and mountains. And the earliest signs of this connectivity are seen in the circulation of raw materials, for the region did not possess every resource it required. Yet stones, metals, and marine shells appear at Harappan sites in large quantities, revealing the strength of its external relationships. And copper, essential for tools and ornaments, arrived from mines in Rajasthan and Oman, while lapis lazuli traveled from the distant mountains of Afghanistan, and marine shells were carried inland from the shores of the Arabian Sea, reaching even the most northern settlements through stable systems of exchange. And these materials were not simply collected, but processed with expertise in workshops dedicated to bead-making, ornament crafting, metallurgy, and stone drilling, showing that entire industries relied on predictable supply routes. And as the Harappans refined their craft traditions, the demand for their goods spread outward, linking the Indus world with Mesopotamia, Central Asia, the Persian Gulf, and perhaps other regions still unknown. And seals bearing Harappan motifs have been found in cities such as and Kish, indicating that merchants from these lands interacted either directly or indirectly. And in Mesopotamian records there are references to a distant land known as Meluha, widely believed to refer to the Indus region, a place described as a source of metals, exotic woods, precious stones and crafted goods. and although many details of these exchanges remain partly hidden by time, the artifacts left behind show that Harappan merchants played an important role in the economic networks of the ancient world. Inland trade flourished as well, supported by standardized weights that were used to measure grain, metals, and other materials, revealing a level of administrative sophistication far beyond simple barter, and caravans moved along routes that connected major cities with smaller settlements, distributing pottery, beads, copper tools, textiles, and food supplies, binding the region into a coordinated economic sphere where ideas and expectations traveled alongside material goods, and the uniformity of weights, measures, seal designs, and brick sizes across thousands of kilometers suggests that deeply rooted conventions governed trade and production, and these conventions did not arise by accident, but required continuous communication and cooperation, showing that the Harappan world valued fairness, predictability, and shared standards in its commercial relationships. As trade grew more complex, the ports along the coast, including the settlement of Lothal, became essential hubs, with structures that appear to have supported maritime activity and workshops that processed goods before they were transported across the Arabian Sea. And these coastal centers acted as gateways connecting inland trade routes with sea routes that linked the civilization to distant cultures, and through these exchanges flowed not only goods but also ideas, influencing pottery styles, techniques of bead polishing, metal casting, textile production, and possibly even symbolic or ritual practices, creating a cultural dialogue that extended far beyond the borders of the Indus region. The movement of beads, shells, stones, metals, and crafted objects across thousands of kilometers demonstrates a level of organization unmatched by many contemporary societies, for while other civilizations relied primarily on local or regional networks, the Harappan world integrated itself into a complex economic system that required careful planning, coordination, and mutual trust, and this integration strengthened the civilization internally, supporting craft centers, reinforcing settlement networks, and helping distant towns maintain stability through predictable flows of resources. And as the mature Harappan era approached, trade became one of the pillars upon which the civilization stood, sustaining its cities, shaping its crafts, and reinforcing its cultural cohesion. And even after the civilization slowly faded, the echoes of its trade networks endured in the patterns of exchange that continued across the subcontinent, shaped by a cultural memory that understood the importance of connection, cooperation, and the steady movement of goods across land and sea. Thus, the networks of trade built by the Harappans formed not only an economic engine, but a cultural bridge that linked distant worlds and created one of the earliest examples of long-distance exchange in human history. As these networks strengthened across generations, the movement of goods, symbols, and ideas wove distant settlements into a shared cultural fabric, and each caravan that crossed the plains or followed the coastline carried not only materials but memory, expectation, and the quiet assurance that distant communities remained part of the same unfolding story. And as merchants repeated familiar routes shaped by climate, geography, and tradition, the exchanges they maintained helped stabilize local economies, ensuring that remote settlements remained connected to the broader rhythm of communication and cooperation that defined this age. In the quiet unfolding of this narrative, there are deeper layers that reveal how every settlement, riverbank, workshop, and household carried stories, shaped by patience and observation. And when we look closer, we see how generations stayed close to the land, learning its language through seasons, through the shifting texture of soil, through the patterns of wind and through the movements of animals, and these subtle interactions between people and environment nurtured a world where memory lived not in written text but in tradition, in the repetition of daily tasks, in the quiet passing of knowledge from one person to another, and in the shared understanding that stability grew from cooperation. With each century, the character of these communities deepened, shaped by the feel of clay, the rhythm of footsteps on narrow paths, sound of water drawn from deep wells, and the gentle glow of lamps that lit the evening hours. And through these details, the civilization shaped itself softly, forming emotional and cultural foundations that would echo long after its cities faded back into the earth, leaving listeners with the sense that every moment, no matter how small, contributed to the calm, balanced spirit that defined this ancient world. As the Harappan world reached the height of its maturity, the people who built its cities, shaped its pottery, managed its long networks of trade, and organized its systems of cooperation, crafted yet another defining element of their civilization, the script, a system of symbols concise, elegant, and unlike any other writing tradition of the ancient world. And although the meaning of these signs remains hidden, the presence of writing across seals, tablets, pottery, weights, tools, and small administrative objects reveals a society that relied on symbolic communication to support economic activity, trade regulation, and perhaps ritual or social identity. And the script of the Indus Valley, composed of hundreds of distinct signs arranged in short but consistent sequences, appears not as the product of a single region or one large city, but as a unified system shared by communities spread across immense distances. And this uniformity, remarkable for a civilization covering nearly 1 million square kilometers, suggests that writing played a practical role woven into the rhythms of daily life. And though the inscriptions are brief, often only 4 to 6 signs, their repetition and structure hint at a mature writing system well suited for marking goods, identifying merchants, classifying materials, or recording administrative categories. And the seals that bear these inscriptions, carved with care from steatite and then fired to create a durable surface, stand among the most iconic artifacts of the Harappan world. For each seal carries not only writing but an image, a glimpse into the symbolic universe of the civilization, where animals such as the humped bull, the elephant, the rhinoceros, the tiger, and above all the enigmatic unicorn-like creature, appear again and again in confident, stylized form. And though the meaning of these images is lost, their consistency across regions suggests that they served functions recognized throughout the civilization, perhaps tied to identity, lineage, trade, or ritual practice. Among these artifacts, the so-called Pashupati seal has drawn particular attention, for it shows a seated figure surrounded by animals, suggesting themes of guardianship, nature, or spiritual authority that echo faintly through later traditions of the subcontinent. Yet even with this tantalizing imagery, the Harappan script remains silent, undeciphered despite decades of scholarly effort, and its silence shapes modern understanding of this civilization, for without readable texts, historians cannot rely on written records to interpret politics, beliefs, or personal stories, and must instead reconstruct Harappan life through architecture, artifacts, and patterns of settlement. Yet the lack of decipherment does not imply a lack of sophistication, for the very existence of such a widespread standardized script suggests a structured administrative world one that required methods of record-keeping, systems of verification, controls on trade, and communication between distant settlements. The precision of the script, together with the standardized weights and measures found across the civilization, supports the idea that the Harpans practiced well-organized commercial activities, with expectations and conventions that were mutually understood across great distances. And though the inscriptions are short, their brevity does not diminish their importance, for many early writing systems began with short labels and administrative marks, and it is entirely possible that longer Harpan texts were written on perishable materials such as cloth, palm leaves, or wood, materials that would not survive the passing of thousands of years, leaving only the durable impressions on seals and pottery to hint at a broader world of communication. As the mature Harpan era continued, the script became deeply embedded in economic life, appearing wherever goods required identification or authentication, and on objects that moved between merchants, craft specialists, and settlements. And this widespread presence shows a civilization that valued clarity and consistency, even without the monumental inscriptions seen in Mesopotamia or Egypt, and the silent signs of the script, scattered across countless excavation sites, remain among the strongest reminders of Harpan cultural unity, a writing system that crossed deserts, river plains, coastal ports, and mountain foothills, linking communities through a shared symbolic language that persists even when its meaning is unknown. As the script continued to appear across pottery, metal tools, seals, and administrative tokens, its presence acted as a quiet thread that held together the vast expanse of the Harpan world. For even without long texts, the consistency of these symbols reveals a shared understanding of communication, one that moved from workshop to marketplace, from household to caravan, and from settlement to settlement, with the same confidence carried by weights, measures, and standardized bricks. And as craftsmen carved each sign with steady hands, they helped sustain a cultural memory rooted in repetition, pattern, and identity, allowing writing to function as a subtle yet powerful part of daily life. And through this silent system of marks and motifs, the Harpan people expressed belonging, order, and a worldview that valued balance and clarity, rather than spectacle or monumental display, leaving behind a script whose mysteries continue to inspire wonder across the ages. In the quiet unfolding of this narrative, there are deeper layers that enrich the listening experience. For every settlement, every workshop, every seal maker's bench and riverbank terrace carried stories shaped by patience and long observation. And when we look closer, we see how generations stayed close to the land, learning its rhythms through seasons, through shifting soil, through changes in water flow, through the presence of animals and the turning of winds. And these subtle exchanges between people and their environment nurtured a world where memory was not written in long texts, but held in tradition, in the repeated movements of hands shaping clay or carving stone, in lessons spoken softly at dawn, or passed quietly in the shade of courtyards, and in the shared understanding that stability and cooperation formed the heart of community life. With each passing century, the character of these settlements deepened, shaped by the textures of pottery that bore short inscriptions, by the rhythm of footsteps along narrow lanes, by the soft sound of water drawn from deep wells, and by the warm glow of lamps that illuminated evening gatherings. And through these details, the civilization shaped itself gently, forming emotional and cultural foundations that would echo long after its cities softened back into the earth, reminding listeners that every symbol carved, every seal stamped, and every quiet record made by the hands of Harappan scribes contributed to the calm, balanced spirit that defined this ancient world. As the mature Harappan world reached its fullest expression, the people who lived across its cities, towns, and riverbank villages revealed their spiritual life, not through towering temples or lavish monuments, but through subtle symbols, carefully shaped objects, and quiet ritual spaces woven into the patterns of daily existence. And unlike the civilizations of Mesopotamia or Egypt, the Harappan belief system left behind no monumental shrines, no vast statues of deities, and no long inscriptions describing gods, creation stories, or cosmologies. Yet, the archaeological record reveals a deeply expressive symbolic world, conveyed through terracotta figurines, carved seals, ritual vessels, small altars, miniature carts, incense holders, and the spatial organization of homes and public areas. And these traces point to a civilization whose spiritual practices were closely tied to nature, fertility, purity, balance, and the quiet governance of order. Themes expressed not through spectacle, but through repetition, care, and cultural memory shared across generations. Among the most recognizable artifacts of this symbolic world are the terracotta figurines, many of which depict female forms with emphasized hips and bodies, suggesting associations with fertility, abundance, or household protection. And these figurines, shaped gently by hand and found in courtyards, rooms, and domestic spaces, reveal that belief and ritual began within the home rather than in grand public temples. And alongside these figures are male figurines, animal figures, and individuals adorned with elaborate headdresses, each one offering a glimpse into the symbolic imagination of the civilization, an imagination that connected daily life with ideas of protection, fertility, and the quiet harmony between people and the natural world. The seals of the Harappan world offer another window into its beliefs, for the animals depicted on them, such as bulls, elephants, tigers, rhinoceroses, and the mysterious unicorn, may have carried ritual or symbolic significance. Spirits in clans, spirits, social roles, or principles tied to nature and cosmic balance. And the famous seal known as the Pashupati seal, showing a seated figure surrounded by animals, suggests themes of meditation, guardianship, and interconnectedness that may have flowed into later traditions of the region. Yet, despite these clues, the deeper meaning of these images remains hidden, shaped by a symbolic language that has outlived the words that once explained it. Further insights arise from ritual objects such as miniature carts, perforated jars, incense burners, and small altars, items whose shapes and designs imply offerings, purification practices, or seasonal rites tied to agriculture, rain, harvest, and renewal. And these objects, found across both urban and rural settlements, reveal that ritual was not the domain of elites or isolated priestly classes, but a shared element of life that touched households of every scale. The presence of fire altars at sites such as Kalibangan adds another dimension to this symbolic world, suggesting controlled ritual fire practices linked to purity, transition, or agricultural cycles. And though these altars differ from those of later cultures, their presence reveals a continuity of symbolic actions that may have echoed across centuries. The spatial layout of Harappan homes offers even more clues, for many houses include bathing platforms, drains, and water storage points, suggesting that cleanliness and purification held cultural significance beyond simple hygiene, and the civilization's vast emphasis on water management, from wells to reservoirs to drainage channels, may reflect beliefs tied to purity, order, stability, and the maintenance of harmony. And this idea of harmony, so deeply embedded in Harappan life, appears not only in architecture, but in ritual practices that relied on balance, repetition, and the careful arrangement of objects. As the mature Harappan era continued, these symbolic practices remained remarkably stable, showing a cultural tradition that valued continuity and gentle refinement over dramatic transformation, and unlike other ancient cultures that sought to express their identity through monumental temples or gigantic statues, the Harappans expressed their beliefs through everyday objects, through the quiet presence of symbols within homes, and through a worldview embedded directly into the design of their cities. For the orderly streets, standardized bricks, ritual bathing areas, and communal spaces reflect an understanding of life that blended practicality with symbolic meaning, shaping a civilization that expressed its spiritual world through calm, subtle forms. The absence of deciphered texts leaves much unknown, but the material record reveals a spiritual world grounded in modesty, in the rhythms of nature, in cycles of fertility and renewal, and in a cultural emphasis on harmony between people, animals, and the environment. And thus the Harappan belief system, though silent, remains one of the most compelling aspects of the civilization, offering a glimpse into a way of life where faith was not proclaimed through spectacle, but woven gently into the patterns of daily existence, creating a society that found meaning,
Pecking order,
balance, continuity, and the enduring presence of symbols that thousands of years later continue to whisper across the quiet ruins of its long-faded cities. As these subtle expressions of belief moved from generation to generation, the symbolic life of the Harappan world grew deeper and more interconnected, shaped not by towering monuments or dramatic rituals but by the quiet rhythms of work, gathering, rest and renewal. And in each household the small figurines, the carefully carved seals, the smooth ritual vessels, and the patterned ornaments served as reminders of a worldview that found meaning in balance and the cycles of nature. And as communities gathered for seasonal rites or moments of reflection, their rituals echoed the land itself, shaped by rain, river, harvest, and the slow turning of time, creating an unbroken thread of spirituality that rested not on proclamation, but on presence, allowing belief to become as natural and enduring as the rivers that sustained their civilization. In the quiet unfolding of this narrative, there are deeper layers that enrich the sense of connection. For every riverbank, every courtyard, every workshop and household carried stories shaped by patience and observation. And when we look closer, we see how generations lingered with the land, learning its language through seasons, through shifting soil, through the movements of birds and animals, and through the turning of winds. And these subtle exchanges between people and their environment nurtured a world where memory lived, not in written texts but in repeated gestures, in daily tasks, in whispered traditions, and in the shared understanding that stability, cooperation, and balance formed the heart of the civilization. With each passing century, the character of these communities deepened, shaped by the textures of clay pressed into figurine, by the rhythm of footsteps along narrow lanes, by the murmur of water drawn from deep wells, and by the warm glow of lamps that illuminated evenings filled with quiet conversation. And through these gentle details the civilization shaped itself softly, forming emotional and cultural foundations that would echo far beyond the fading of its cities, leaving listeners with the sense that every moment, no matter how small or silent, contributed to the enduring calm and balance that defined the spirit of this ancient world. Social life, work, and the rhythm of daily living as the mature Harappan world flourished across its vast landscape. The great cities and smaller towns that formed the heart of the civilization were sustained not only by their architecture and trade networks, but by the daily lives of the people who lived within them. And although no written documents describe their routines, the archaeological record reveals a way of life shaped by rhythm, order, and cooperation, a society that valued balance between work and home, between craft and agriculture, between individual households and the greater whole, and within the walled cities and open settlements alike. Homes were carefully constructed with courtyards, bathing areas, private wells, and multi-room designs that speak to a structured approach to domestic life. And these houses, often made from standardized bricks, reveal not only engineering skill, but a cultural expectation of privacy, cleanliness, and stability, and many contained grinding stones, storage vessels, hearths, and raised platforms, showing that food preparation, storage, and daily chores followed established patterns. And in the courtyards, families gathered, children played, and small-scale craftwork took place, shaping a domestic world that supported both routine and creativity. And outside the home, the streets of the cities served as shared spaces of movement and interaction, with wide main roads and narrower lanes connecting neighborhoods, markets, and public areas. And these streets, kept clean by an advanced drainage system, show a collective commitment to order and hygiene, which in turn reflects a social system in which cooperation was necessary to maintain the infrastructure. And in workshops scattered throughout the cities, craft specialists worked on pottery, beads, copper tools, shell ornaments, and seals, each contributing to the economic fabric of the civilization. And their tools, kilns, and raw materials reveal a world where work was both skilled and organized, with certain neighborhoods dedicated to particular crafts, indicating that knowledge was passed down through apprenticeships and family traditions. And in agricultural regions outside the major cities, farmers cultivated wheat, barley, sesame, and possibly rice, using systems of irrigation and seasonal floods to sustain their crops. And livestock were herded and managed with care, providing meat, milk, traction, and materials such as leather and bone. And these rural communities, though smaller than the cities, were essential to the stability of the entire civilization, for they provided the food surplus that made urban life possible, and trade further connected these rural and urban worlds. For merchants moved between settlements carrying pottery, textiles, copper tools, beads, and grains, participating in networks that ensured resources were distributed across the region. And in social terms, the Harappan world appears to have been relatively egalitarian compared to other ancient civilizations, for there is little evidence of large palaces, massive wealth disparities, or elite burials, and instead, houses across cities are generally similar in size and structure, suggesting a society in which status differences existed but were not expressed through monumental architecture or lavish tombs. And this absence of overt hierarchy has fascinated scholars, for it indicates a culture that prioritized communal order and shared responsibility over centralized authority. And in daily life, people likely observed seasonal rituals, social gatherings, craft fairs, and agricultural festivals, though the details remain unknown. and games such as dice, bead-like counters, and board patterns carved into stone hint at leisure activities enjoyed by both children and adults, and the presence of toys, miniature carts, and animal figurines shows that children were an integral part of the domestic world, participating in play that mirrored the work and environment around them. And as evening arrived in the great cities, lamps made from terracotta would have cast soft light through doorways and courtyards, illuminating scenes of cooking, conversation, and rest, and water drawn from wells would have been used for bathing and preparation of the next day's meals. And across the rooftops, families may have gathered to escape the heat, watching the quiet streets below, and listening to the gentle flow of water through the drainage channels running beneath them. And this rhythm of life, steady and grounded, formed the cultural heartbeat of the Harappan world, a world defined not by kings or wars but by the shared routines of thousands of people, whose cooperation, skill, and quiet dedication sustained one of the most remarkable civilizations of the ancient era. And though their script remains silent, their homes, tools, toys, and towns speak loudly of a society that mastered the art of living with balance, purpose, and enduring harmony. As evening settled gently over these ancient towns and cities, the rhythm of daily living softened into a quieter harmony, and families gathered in open courtyards to share meals prepared from the grain they had milled earlier in the day, while the faint glow of terracotta lamps illuminated the patterned walls and smooth floors shaped by generations of careful maintenance. And in these moments of rest, the sound of distant workshops faded into a soft hum, replaced by quiet conversations, the laughter of children, and the rustling of night winds moving through narrow lanes. And across rooftops people paused to look over their neighborhoods, watching the last traces of daylight settle over Wells Street and the intricate drainage channels that carried water beneath their feet. And in this gentle stillness, the unity of their shared world became clear, for every household, every craft, every field and storage jar, and every careful architectural choice echoed the same principles of balance, cooperation, and enduring calm that defined the heart of their civilization. And it was in these everyday rituals, more than in any monument or relic, that the true spirit of Harappan social life quietly endured across centuries. In the quiet unfolding of this narrative, there are further layers that deepen the listening experience. For every settlement, riverbank, workshop, and household carried stories shaped by patience and observation, and when we look closer, we see how generations lingered with the land, learning its language through seasons, shifts in soil, movements of animals, and the turning of winds. And these subtle exchanges between people and their environment nurtured a world where memory was not written in texts but carried in tradition, in the unspoken passing of methods, in the calm repetition of daily tasks, and in the shared understanding that stability grew from cooperation. And so with each passing century, the character of these communities deepened, shaped by the textures of clay, the rhythm of footsteps along narrow paths, the murmur of water stored in deep wells, and the gentle glow of lamps that illuminated evening gatherings. And through these details the civilization shaped itself quietly, forming the emotional and cultural foundations that would echo long after its cities softened into earth, leaving listeners with the sense that every moment, no matter how small, contributed to the enduring calm and balance that defined the spirit of this ancient world. As the mature Harappan civilization reached its greatest extent, the landscape of the Indus Valley transformed into a network of cities that stood unmatched in planning, scale, and civic organization. And among these, two cities rose as the clearest expressions of the civilization's architectural genius. Harappa in the north and Mohenjo Daro in the lower Indus, and though each city developed in its own context, both reveal a level of planning so precise and thoughtful that modern scholars still marvel at the sophistication achieved by a society that left behind no known kings, palaces, or monumental inscriptions. And Harappa, one of the earliest discovered sites, sprawled across multiple mounds, each representing different sectors of urban life, and its layout, divided into organized blocks, wide avenues, and carefully managed drainage systems, shows a city designed not through improvisation, but through deliberate, large-scale planning and the presence of fortified areas, granaries, workshops, and residential zones indicates a complex urban system that required coordination and shared governance, and bricks used in Harappa followed a standardized ratio found across the entire civilization, revealing a cultural commitment to uniformity that extended from the smallest village to the largest city. And as archaeologists excavated deeper, they uncovered evidence of advanced water management, including wells placed throughout neighborhoods, bathing platforms in homes, and covered drains that carried wastewater beneath the streets, all of which suggest a society deeply concerned with cleanliness and public health. And these drainage systems, unmatched by many later civilizations, demonstrate engineering expertise that prioritized long-term sustainability, for the channels were laid with precision, often sloped to ensure consistent flow, and regularly maintained by the inhabitants. And Mohenjo Daro, located far to the south, stands as an even more striking example of Harappan urban design, for its grid layout, elevated citadel, and lower town reveal a sophisticated division of public and private space. And the citadel, constructed on a massive mud brick platform, housed large public structures including assembly halls, storage buildings, and the iconic Great Bath, a sunken pool lined with finely fitted bricks and sealed with bitumen, which indicates a complex understanding of waterproofing, hydraulic engineering, and communal ritual. And the Great Bath, one of the most remarkable structures of the ancient world, suggests a society whose rituals involve purification, water, or communal gatherings, even though no texts explain its purpose. And the houses of Mohenjo Daro, arranged along straight streets, were equipped with private wells, bathing rooms, and drains leading into a city-wide disposal system. And these features show that indoor plumbing, a luxury rarely seen in the ancient world, was a standard part of Harappan urban life. And unlike civilizations that built palaces or temples as centers of authority, the Harappans focused on civic infrastructure, public order, and standardized construction, leaving no clear trace of rulers or centralized monarchies, which raises profound questions about how such a complex urban system functioned. And it is possible that authority rested in councils, merchant groups, priestly communities, or rotating administrative bodies, each contributing to the governance of the city. And the layout of Mohenjo Daro includes granaries, workshops, marketplaces, and residential blocks, all carefully aligned according to a master plan that required foresight and collective decision-making. And the consistency of this planning across multiple cities reveals a shared cultural blueprint, an architectural language understood across vast regions. And wells, some more than 10 meters deep, were built with precise brickwork, ensuring access to clean water throughout the year. And these wells, present in nearly every house, reflect the importance of water not only in ritual but in daily life, providing convenience and independence for each household. and the streets, wide and straight, were designed to handle both foot traffic and carts, and many were equipped with raised platforms or boundary markers that managed movement and defined space. And beneath the streets, the drainage system formed a hidden infrastructure that kept the city clean, functioning like the arteries of an organized organism, and the rooftops of the houses, flat and accessible, provided additional living spaces where families likely gathered in the evenings to escape the heat, look over the city, and participate in the quiet rhythm of urban life. And as the sun set over the Indus plains, the great cities would have glowed with lamplight, with shadows cast across mud-brick walls, and with the faint sound of water moving through the engineered channels below. And in the stillness of night, one could sense the immense coordination required to sustain such a city, a coordination achieved not through ostentatious rule, but through shared cultural values, order, and mutual responsibility. And the cities of Harappa and Mohenjo Daro, even in their ruins, preserve a sense of calm precision, of balanced design, and of human ingenuity, expressed not through conquest but through cooperation, and their legacy endures as one of the finest examples of urban planning in the ancient world, a testament to a civilization that mastered the art of building cities long before the world learned to write its own history in stone. As the days moved across the broad avenues and quiet neighborhoods of these cities, the harmony between structure and daily life revealed itself in countless subtle ways, for the flow of people through narrow lanes, the steady use of wells and bathing rooms, the movement of carts along major streets, and the soft echo of footsteps along brick-lined pathways all reflected an underlying order shaped by generations of accumulated knowledge, and each carefully aligned street served not only practical needs, but carried an unspoken sense of balance, giving the cities a rhythm that supported both work and rest. And as sunsets cast warm light across mud-brick walls, families on rooftops would see the city breathe beneath them, its drainage channels murmuring with the faint movement of water, its courtyards alive with quiet conversation, and its wide streets resting under the watch of the citadel above. And in these tranquil transitions between day and night, the remarkable unity of Harappan design became clear, revealing an ancient world shaped not by the authority of rulers, but by the collective intention of a people who valued order, clarity, and the gentle comfort of a well-planned life. In the quiet unfolding of this narrative, there are further layers that deepen the listening experience, for every settlement, riverbank, workshop and household carried stories shaped by patience and observation, and when we look closer, we see how generations lingered with the land, learning its language through seasons, shifts in soil, movements of animals, and the turning of winds. And these subtle exchanges between people and their environment nurtured a world where memory was not written in texts but carried in tradition, in the unspoken passing of methods, in the calm repetition of daily tasks, and in the shared understanding that stability grew from cooperation. And so with each passing century the character of these communities deepened, shaped by the textures of clay, the rhythm of footsteps along narrow paths, the murmur of water stored in deep wells, and the gentle glow of lamps that illuminated evening gatherings. And through these details the civilization shaped itself quietly, forming the emotional and cultural foundations that would echo long after its cities softened into earth, leaving listeners with the sense that every moment, no matter how small, contributed to the enduring calm and balance that defined the spirit of this ancient world. As the developing Harappan world moved steadily toward full urban expression, the people who lived across the plains and river valleys of the Northwest began shaping not only their settlements, but their cultural identity and this identity emerged gradually through the objects they made, the materials they valued, the technologies they refined, and the aesthetic choices that silently connected distant communities into a unified civilization. And it is in this age that the crafts of the Indus Valley began to flourish with extraordinary depth. For artisans across the region produced pottery, beads, tools, ornaments, figurines, and seals with a level of skill, consistency, and refinement rarely seen in the ancient world, and the objects they left behind reveal a society that cared deeply about precision, balance, and quiet beauty. Even though it did not seek grandeur in colossal monuments or dramatic sculptures, and the pottery of this era, shaped from carefully selected clay and fired with practiced control, often adorned with simple geometric patterns or smooth burnished surfaces, speaks to artistic intention supported by technical mastery. For each vessel shows choices that reflect generations of knowledge passed through families and workshops, and beads, among the most celebrated artifacts of the Harappan tradition, were produced in remarkable quantities and astonishing variety, using carnelian, steatite, faience, shell, agate, jasper, lapis lazuli, and other treasured materials, and the making of these beads required controlled heating, precise drilling, and delicate polishing, tasks that demanded patience, specialized tools, and years of experience. And the presence of such beads in far distant regions, from Mesopotamia to Central Asia, reveals the long trade networks that connected the Harappan world to neighboring regions, networks that moved goods, ideas, and cultural meanings across immense distances. In addition to ornaments, the people of this period crafted tools from copper, stone, and bone, and these tools were not crude or improvised but standardized and designed for specific tasks, revealing a stable technological base and an advanced understanding of material properties. And among their most distinctive creations were the seals carved from steatite, featuring animals, symbols, and early inscriptions that would later form the core of the Harappan script. And these seals were not merely decorative items but functional devices used to mark goods, secure containers, identify ownership, and support systems of trade and administration, suggesting that long before the rise of monumental writing, the Harappan world had already developed organized economic systems. The motifs that appear on these seals, from the humped bull to the unicorn-like creature to the elephant, rhinoceros, tiger, and various abstract symbols, reveal a shared visual language that formed an essential part of Harappan cultural identity. And even though the meanings of these symbols remain undeciphered, they reflect a worldview rooted in ritual, memory, and a deep connection to animals and nature. And their uniformity across vast regions demonstrates the strong cultural cohesion that shaped this civilization. This cohesion extended beyond art and ornament into broader expressions of standardization, for similar weights, measures, and brick sizes appear across thousands of kilometers, showing that a single conceptual framework for building, measuring, and organizing space connected the scattered settlements of the region into a unified cultural zone. And such standardization required communication, shared understanding, and mutual trust, all of which reveal a society deeply interconnected through trade, craft specialization, and shared values. As artisans refined their skills over the centuries, their creations became essential to the economic systems that linked settlements together, forming networks that moved raw materials, finished goods, and perhaps even stories and beliefs across long distances. And these networks strengthened the bonds between communities, helping to unify the region into a cultural landscape that would soon give rise to a fully developed Harappan identity. The craftsmanship of the Indus Valley did more than shape daily life, for it supported long-distance trade, influenced social roles, and expressed cultural meaning in ways that endured long after the civilization itself had faded, leaving behind objects that offer modern researchers one of the clearest windows into this ancient world, a world that valued precision, balance, order, and subtle artistry above displays of power or monumental architecture. As artisans passed their methods across generations, their work grew into an expression of identity woven through texture, color, and form, and each bead, seal, pot, figurine, and carved fragment held layers of meaning that revealed how the people of this world understood beauty, utility, and memory. As workshops expanded within growing settlements, the rhythm of shaping clay, polishing stone, carving steatite, and firing pottery blended seamlessly into daily life, filling the air with sounds that echoed through the narrow streets and shaded courtyards. And through these shared activities, the people of the early Harappan world formed a subtle yet unmistakable cultural signature, one that continued to strengthen as the civilization approached its fully matured form. In the quiet unfolding of this narrative, there are deeper layers that enrich the listening experience, for every settlement, every riverbank, every workshop and household carried stories shaped by patience, observation, and long familiarity with the land. And when we look closer, we see how generations lingered with their environment, learning its language through the rise and fall of seasons, through the patterns of soil after rain, through the shifts in water flow, through the movements of birds and animals, and through the shifting winds that carried hints of approaching monsoon or lingering summer heat. And these subtle exchanges between people and their environment nurtured a world where memory was not preserved through writing, but through lived tradition, through the steady repetition of tasks performed with care, through lessons spoken quietly at dawn or during work, through the careful watching of skilled hands shaping raw materials into objects of purpose, and through the shared understanding that stability and harmony grew from cooperation rather than struggle. With each passing century, the character of these communities deepened, shaped by the textures of clay drying under sunlight, by the faint echo of footsteps along narrow paths, by the murmur of water stored in deep wells, by the glow of lamps that illuminated evening gatherings. And through these countless details, the civilization shaped itself quietly, forming emotional and cultural foundations that would echo long after its cities softened into earth, reminding listeners that every small act of care, every crafted object, and every moment of shared labor contributed to the enduring calm and balance that defined the spirit of this ancient world. As the long arc of the Harappan world faded into new landscapes and new cultural identities, the civilization that had once stretched across river plains, deserts, and coastal lands did not vanish, but transformed, leaving behind a legacy woven silently into the fabric of South Asia. And though the great cities were eventually abandoned, their ideas, technologies, and cultural patterns continued through the generations that followed, shaping the development of later societies in ways both subtle and profound. And the legacy of the Indus Valley Civilization begins with its mastery of urban planning for the grid-based layouts, standardized brick sizes, drainage systems, and water management practices pioneered by the Harappans influenced settlement designs across the subcontinent. And even in later centuries, villages and towns retained patterns of construction and street alignment reminiscent of their ancient predecessors, showing that the lessons of urban order endured long after the cities themselves had faded. And the emphasis on sanitation, visible in the vast network of drains, wells, and bathing spaces, left an imprint on cultural values associated with cleanliness, purity, and daily ritual, values that continued to evolve in later South Asian traditions, and the Harappan focus on standardization, seen in weights, measures, bricks, and craft production, contributed to long-term economic stability and influenced trade systems for generations, creating patterns of exchange that integrated regions across thousands of kilometers, and the presence of artistic motifs, such as animal representations, geometric designs, and seal imagery, suggests symbolic ideas that may have persisted within later cultural expressions. And while the exact meaning of these motifs remains unknown, their recurrence in later artistic traditions hints at deep cultural memory, stretching back to the Harappan age. And in agriculture, the Harappans left behind knowledge of crop rotation, irrigation, and seasonal planning, all of which shaped the agricultural foundations of later societies, providing continuity in food production and settlement behavior. And the terracotta figurines, miniature carts, toys, and ritual objects found across Harappan sites reveal a domestic and symbolic world that would resonate in later cultural practices, for these small artifacts hint at continuities in household ritual, children's play, and symbolic expression, and even in belief systems. Though the exact nature of Harappan spirituality remains unknown, the emphasis on nature, animals, fertility, and possibly meditative or proto-yogic postures suggests cultural threads that would later reappear in the symbolic and ritual life of South Asia, echoing quietly through evolving traditions. And perhaps the most profound legacy of the Harappan world lies not in what it left behind but in the questions it continues to raise, for without deciphered texts, the civilization remains an open narrative, a story glimpsed through architecture, artifacts, and patterns rather than words. And this silence has shaped modern understanding of the ancient world, reminding us that greatness does not always need monuments or declarations to endure. And as archaeologists continue to excavate, new discoveries reveal more about the complexity, diversity, and adaptability of the Harappan world, from distant trade connections to regional variations, from craft specializations to environmental adaptation, and each new finding expands the picture of a civilization that thrived through cooperation, precision, and shared cultural values. And in the broader story of human history, the Indus Valley Civilization stands as a rare example of urban achievement, built not on conquest or monumental power, but on planning, balance, and the quiet mastery of daily life. And its cities, though now reduced to ruins and foundations, speak through the order of their streets, the alignment of their wells, the symmetry of their bricks, and the enduring calm of their design. And standing among these ruins today, one may feel the quiet strength of a civilization that understood the power of cooperation, the value of stability, and the importance of living in harmony with the land. And as the sun sets over the ancient mounds of Harappa, Mohenjo Daro, Dholavira, and countless smaller sites, the air carries a faint echo of the world that once thrived here, a world that, despite its silence, continues to shape the memory of the subcontinent. And in that echo lives the enduring legacy of the first great civilization of South Asia, a civilization whose story remains unfinished, waiting in the earth for new voices, new discoveries, and new understanding to bring its memory once more into the light. As the memory of this civilization continued to drift softly across centuries, carried in the quiet endurance of pottery styles, architectural habits, agricultural traditions, and subtle ritual practices, its essence remained alive even when its cities no longer stood. And in the generations that followed, the descendants of the Harappan world carried fragments of its order into new regions, allowing the gentle clarity of its design, its emphasis on balance, and its deep respect for the land to shape the evolving cultures of the subcontinent. and in the stillness of the ruins where wind moves through broken walls and sunlight rests on ancient bricks, one can still sense the lingering presence of a people who built not for conquest or glory, but for harmony, continuity, and the quiet hope that their world, rooted in cooperation and gentle discipline, would endure through time. And though their script remains unread, and their voices silent, the imprint of their civilization continues to glow softly beneath the surface of history, a reminder that some of the greatest achievements in human story are not shouted but whispered across ages, preserved in the architecture of memory, rather than the monuments of power. In the quiet unfolding of this narrative, there are further layers that deepen the listening experience. For every settlement, riverbank, workshop and household carried stories shaped by patience and observation, and when we look closer, we see how generations lingered with the land, learning its language through seasons, shifts in soil, movements of animals, and the turning of winds, and these subtle exchanges between people and their environment nurtured a world where memory was not written in texts, but carried in tradition, in the unspoken passing of methods, in the calm repetition of daily tasks, and in the shared understanding that stability grew from cooperation. And so with each passing century, the character of these communities deepened, shaped by the textures of clay, the rhythm of footsteps along narrow paths, the murmur of water stored in deep wells, and the gentle glow of lamps that illuminated evening gatherings. And through these details, the civilization shaped itself quietly, forming the emotional and cultural foundations that would echo long after its cities softened into earth, leaving listeners with the sense that every moment, no matter how small, contributed to the enduring calm and balance that defined the spirit of this ancient world.